When everything around you follows rules you were never taught, when kindness feels unfamiliar and danger does not appear where you expect it, what happens inside a person when captivity introduces him to a world he does not know how to read? The first confusion did not come from captivity itself, because captivity was expected, prepared for mentally, and framed within ideas that had been carried long before capture ever became real. What unsettled the men was not that they were prisoners, but that the environment around them did not behave according to the logic they had been taught to expect. They had prepared themselves for brutality, for punishment, for rigid dominance enforced through fear, because that was how surrender had been described, imagined, and understood. Instead, they encountered a system that did not immediately announce itself as hostile, one that moved quietly, followed procedures that felt inconsistent, and offered signals that were difficult to interpret. This inconsistency created uncertainty more effectively than violence would have, because violence confirms expectation, while unfamiliar calm forces the mind to search for meaning. The men watched closely, not for escape, but for pattern, trying to locate danger in familiar places and failing to find it where they expected. Rules existed, yet they did not resemble the rules they knew, lacking the visible structure that would have made them easier to understand. Authority was present, but it did not assert itself in ways that matched prior assumptions, creating a space where obedience did not always feel clearly demanded. The men found themselves hesitating not because they refused to comply, but because compliance required understanding, and understanding had not yet formed. Simple actions carried uncertainty because the usual indicators of threat, reward, or consequence did not align with experience. The absence of immediate punishment felt suspicious rather than reassuring, because mercy had not been part of the framework through which surrender had been imagined. The men questioned whether restraint was temporary, whether calm masked intention, or whether something else was being tested quietly. This uncertainty placed strain on perception itself, because perception depends on reference, and reference had become unreliable. The environment did not announce its purpose, forcing the men to interpret rather than react, a task that demanded constant attention. They found themselves observing details that would normally be ignored, changes in tone, timing, and response, searching for clarity in small variations. The lack of clarity made even neutral actions feel charged, because neutrality can hide intention as easily as aggression. The men struggled to determine whether they were being evaluated, ignored, or deliberately unsettled, because the system did not confirm any of these possibilities. Time did not resolve this confusion quickly, because repetition did not bring familiarity, only continued mismatch. Each day reinforced the sense that this world followed a different internal logic, one that could not be accessed through prior knowledge. The men realized that survival would not depend solely on endurance, but on learning to read a system that did not speak their language. This realization deepened the sense of displacement, because displacement was no longer only physical, but cognitive. They were not only removed from home, but from the mental framework that had once allowed them to predict outcomes. The men adapted by slowing themselves internally, delaying reaction until understanding could catch up, even when that delay felt uncomfortable. This slowing created distance between impulse and action, a pause that had not existed before captivity. The pause was not strategic, but protective, allowing time for interpretation in a world that resisted quick judgment. They learned that certainty was dangerous here, because certainty was built on assumptions that no longer applied. What replaced certainty was caution, not fear-driven, but observation-driven, grounded in the recognition that misreading this environment could carry unseen consequences. The men became aware that their old instincts no longer guaranteed safety, forcing them to recalibrate how they responded to authority, permission, and restraint. This recalibration was exhausting because it required constant mental effort in a place where clarity would have reduced strain. The unfamiliarity of the system prevented emotional settling, keeping the men in a state of alert curiosity rather than panic. They did not yet feel broken or defeated, but they felt unanchored, suspended between expectation and experience. The world they had entered did not oppose them openly, but it did not welcome understanding either, existing in a space that demanded patience without offering explanation. By the end of this phase, the men understood one thing clearly: that captivity here would not test strength or resistance first, but perception itself, requiring them to learn a new way of reading the world before they could even begin to feel oriented within it. Many people who enjoy these stories watch on television. Subscribing helps make sure the next story appears automatically. As the days continued, without resolving the initial confusion, the men began to realize that understanding this new environment would not come through observation alone, but through interpretation, because what they saw did not explain why it happened. Actions carried no obvious emotional signal. Commands were delivered without emphasis, and restraint appeared without the visible force that would normally clarify intention. The men struggled to determine whether calm reflected indifference, control, or something more deliberate, because none of these possibilities could be confirmed through familiar cues. Authority did not display itself through dominance, yet remained undeniably present, shaping behavior without announcing itself openly. This subtlety forced the men to question their assumptions, because authority that does not declare itself cannot be challenged or obeyed in predictable ways. They found themselves replaying interactions internally, searching for meaning after the fact, attempting to decode tone, timing, and response. Small gestures became significant, pauses were examined closely, and silence itself felt instructive, even when it offered no clear message. The men realized that this system required them to infer intention rather than respond to it, a reversal of the logic they had been trained to follow. This requirement created mental strain because inference demands constant evaluation, and evaluation without confirmation leads to uncertainty. They could not tell whether restraint signaled trust, strategy, or something temporary, leaving them unable to settle emotionally. The absence of visible punishment made compliance feel ambiguous, because obedience usually gains clarity through consequence, and consequence remained indistinct. The men began to sense that meaning was not being delivered to them, but expected to be constructed internally. This expectation shifted the burden of understanding onto them, forcing adaptation not through instruction, but through interpretation. They learned that misreading intention could carry consequences that were not immediate, making caution necessary even in the absence of threat. The environment demanded attentiveness rather than submission, awareness rather than resistance, a dynamic that felt unfamiliar and destabilizing. The men found themselves hesitating before action, not out of fear, but out of uncertainty about how actions would be interpreted rather than received. Intentions on both sides remained unclear, creating a space where behavior could not be easily categorized as safe or unsafe. This ambiguity altered how the men related to authority, because authority without visible force invites speculation rather than reaction. They did not feel free, but they did not feel fully constrained either, existing instead within a framework that required continuous mental adjustment. The effort to interpret replaced the instinct to resist, redirecting energy inward toward understanding rather than outward toward defiance. This redirection reduced overt tension, but increased cognitive load, as every interaction required careful reading. The men became aware that they were being shaped not by what was done to them, but by what was left undefined. Undefined systems demand compliance through uncertainty, because uncertainty discourages decisive action. They noticed that certainty itself felt risky, because certainty was built on assumptions that no longer aligned with experience. Gradually, they accepted that this world did not communicate through familiar forms of authority, requiring a different kind of attentiveness. The men began to adapt by withholding interpretation until patterns could be confirmed, learning to live without immediate understanding. This adaptation did not resolve confusion, but it stabilized behavior, allowing them to function within ambiguity. Meaning remained incomplete, yet survival no longer depended on resolving it fully, only on navigating it carefully. By the end of this phase, the men understood that captivity here was not defined by overt control, but by the constant need to interpret intention without guidance, a condition that reshaped how they perceived power, safety, and compliance, and prepared them for the deeper internal adjustments that would follow. As interpretation replaced instruction, the men began to sense that their behavior was no longer being shaped primarily by external command, but by the uncertainty that surrounded every action, because uncertainty demands caution even when no rule is spoken aloud. Without clear signals of approval or punishment, they could not rely on reaction to guide adjustment, forcing them to anticipate outcomes rather than respond to them. This anticipation slowly shifted responsibility inward, as each man learned that restraint was safest when chosen rather than enforced. Discipline no longer arrived as an order to be followed, but as a precaution adopted, a way of minimizing risk in an environment where risk could not be clearly identified. The men noticed that even small actions began to carry weight, because weight was no longer assigned by authority, but by the possibility of misinterpretation. They adjusted their movements, their speech, and their interactions, not because they were told to do so, but because uncertainty encouraged moderation. This moderation did not feel like submission, because submission implies an acknowledged superior force, and no such force was clearly present. Instead, it felt like self-management, a careful calibration of behavior designed to avoid drawing attention in a system that did not explain itself. The men became increasingly aware of their own impulses, learning to slow them, measure them, and sometimes suppress them, not out of fear, but out of calculation. Calculation replaced instinct, because instinct had been trained for a different environment, one where threat was visible and intention declared. In this new setting, restraint became a personal strategy rather than a response to command, and discipline took on an internal quality. The men did not discuss this shift openly, because discussion would have required shared understanding, and shared understanding was still forming unevenly. Instead, discipline spread quietly through observation, as individuals noticed which behaviors attracted no attention and which introduced uncertainty. Over time, these observations solidified into informal norms, not written or spoken, but practiced consistently. The men learned that predictability was safer than assertion and alignment safer than expression. This learning shaped daily routines, making them smoother and less variable, as individuals chose caution over initiative. What emerged was a form of order that did not originate from authority, but from collective adjustment to ambiguity. The absence of explicit rules made this order feel voluntary, even though it guided behavior as effectively as command might have. The men experienced this internal discipline as necessary because it reduced the mental strain of constant interpretation. By regulating themselves, They reduced the number of situations that required reading intention, allowing life to proceed with fewer uncertainties. This self-regulation created a sense of control, not over the environment, but over one's own exposure to it. The men began to value this control because it offered stability in a setting that resisted clarity. As discipline became internal, behavior became more uniform, not through enforcement, but through shared caution. Differences softened, not erased, as individuals adapted to a common understanding of what was safest. This common understanding did not feel imposed because it arose from experience rather than instruction. The men did not feel constrained by this discipline because it had been chosen incrementally, step by step, in response to ambiguity. What constrained them instead was the environment's refusal to explain itself, making restraint the most reliable option. By the end of this phase, discipline no longer depended on rules being announced or enforced because it had relocated inside the individual, guiding behavior quietly and continuously, shaped by the need to navigate a world that could not be read easily, and setting the foundation for deeper changes in how the men related to one another within this unfamiliar system. As self-discipline settled into daily behavior, the men began to look toward one another for confirmation, not through instruction or agreement, but through subtle comparison, because in an unreadable world, the behavior of others offered the closest thing to guidance. They noticed patterns forming quietly, not imposed from above, but emerging from shared caution as individuals aligned themselves with what appeared least likely to attract attention. This alignment did not feel coordinated because no one had proposed it, yet became visible through repetition as similar choices were made independently by many. The men began to measure their actions against the group, adjusting tone, movement, and timing based on what others seemed to accept without consequence. This comparison replaced external reference because authority no longer clarified expectation, leaving social alignment to fill the gap. The group did not become unified through belief or loyalty, but through practicality, as predictability reduced uncertainty for everyone involved. Those who acted in ways that diverged slightly from emerging norms did not face punishment, but they attracted attention, and attention itself became uncomfortable. The men learned that visibility carried risk, not because risk was proven, but because risk could not be ruled out. As a result, behavior gravitated toward what blended in, toward actions that neither stood out nor invited interpretation. This blending softened individuality, not through suppression, but through adaptation, as individuals chose alignment over distinction. The group did not pressure openly, yet pressure existed implicitly, carried by the awareness that difference increased uncertainty. Silence between men grew more meaningful, because silence allowed behavior to be observed without explanation, reinforcing alignment without conversation. The men did not discuss norms, because discussion would have required clarity, and clarity remained unavailable. Instead, norms stabilized through imitation, as actions repeated themselves often enough to feel correct. Those who moved calmly and consistently became informal references, not leaders, but examples of how to exist without friction. Their behavior did not command, but it reassured, offering models of conduct that seemed to pass unnoticed. Others followed, not out of respect, but out of relief, because copying reduced the burden of interpretation. This quiet imitation created cohesion without solidarity, a form of togetherness rooted in shared caution rather than shared purpose. Relationships adjusted accordingly, becoming less expressive and more observational, as emotional display introduced variables that could not be easily read. The men interacted with restraint, not because trust was absent, but because restraint minimized uncertainty in a system that already demanded constant adjustment. What emerged was a group shaped by mutual monitoring rather than mutual support, where awareness replaced communication. This awareness did not feel hostile, but it limited spontaneity, narrowing the range of acceptable behavior. The men accepted this narrowing because it offered stability, and stability had become valuable in an environment resistant to explanation. As alignment increased, the group itself became a stabilizing structure, compensating for the lack of clear external signals. Behavior felt safer when it matched what others were doing, creating a feedback loop that reinforced conformity without requiring enforcement. The men did not feel controlled by one another, because control implies intent, and intent remained diffuse. Instead, they felt guided by the collective presence, shaped by the quiet understanding that deviation increased exposure. By the end of this phase, the group had become the primary reference for acceptable behavior, not through authority or agreement, but through shared adaptation to uncertainty, forming a subtle internal order that helped each man navigate a world he still did not fully understand, and preparing the ground for the final stage, when this social alignment would begin to replace external reality altogether. As the group's quiet alignment settled into place, the unfamiliar environment gradually lost its sharp edges, not because it had been understood, but because it had been absorbed into routine. What had once demanded constant interpretation no longer required the same level of attention. As repeated exposure softened uncertainty and reduced the need for continuous analysis, the men found that they no longer questioned every action or signal, because patterns, though never explained, had become predictable enough to rely on. This predictability did not come from clarity, but from repetition, as similar outcomes followed similar behaviors often enough to suggest a usable logic. The world remained different from anything they had known, yet it no longer felt unreadable, because reading had been replaced by familiarity. The men did not feel that they had mastered the system, but they felt less vulnerable within it, having learned how to exist without provoking confusion or attention. Actions that once required hesitation became automatic, guided by internalized caution rather than conscious interpretation. This automation reduced mental strain, allowing attention to settle into the present rather than remain fixed on potential threat. The environment ceased to feel actively deceptive, not because intention was revealed, but because uncertainty had become manageable. The men no longer searched constantly for hidden meaning, because searching itself had proven exhausting without offering resolution. Instead, they accepted that full understanding was unnecessary for survival, and that partial familiarity was sufficient. This acceptance allowed emotional responses to flatten, reducing peaks of anxiety and replacing them with steadier endurance. The group's shared patterns became ingrained, reinforcing behavior without discussion, as what felt normal replaced what felt strange. Normality here did not resemble comfort, but it provided stability, and stability had become the primary measure of safety. The men experienced fewer moments of cognitive dissonance, because expectations had adjusted to match reality rather than challenge it. They no longer reacted to kindness with suspicion or to restraint with anticipation of reversal, because these reactions had yielded no useful insight. Instead, they treated the environment as it presented itself, without attempting to force it into older frameworks. This shift marked the completion of adaptation, not through comprehension, but through coexistence with difference. The men lived within a system they still could not fully explain, yet explanation was no longer required to function. The unfamiliar world had not become familiar in origin, but it had become familiar in practice. This familiarity reshaped identity further, as the men ceased to define themselves in opposition to their surroundings. They no longer thought in terms of this is not how it should be, because should belong to a context that no longer applied. The present defined itself on its own terms, and the men adjusted to those terms without resistance. The group continued to serve as reference, reinforcing what felt safe and predictable, allowing individual behavior to remain aligned without effort. Differences in perception faded as shared experience produced shared response. The world they had entered no longer felt like an active test of understanding, but like a condition to be lived within. This condition did not invite trust, but it no longer demanded suspicion either, occupying a neutral space between the two. By the end of this phase, the men had fully adapted to a world they still did not intellectually understand, yet no longer needed to question, having learned how to exist within it through repetition, alignment, and quiet acceptance, completing the transformation from initial confusion to sustained normality inside an unfamiliar system. In the end, understanding never fully arrived because it was no longer required in order to continue. The world they had entered remained different, unfamiliar in origin, yet livable through repetition and quiet adjustment. What began as confusion gradually became routine, not through answers, but through acceptance of what could not be read. And so they lived on, not because the world had revealed itself, but because they had learned how to exist within it without needing it to make sense. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.